our class plan for the time we've got left. So we've got 5 classes, including today. Now, we may shift this just a little bit. So assignment 2A is due next week. We've already gone over everything you need for that, for implementing authentication in your assignment. So hopefully some of you, I've gotten a few GitHub invites already, so that's good. That shows me people are working on it. So that's due next Monday. Originally in the syllabus, I allocated 2 classes for unit testing. But when I went to kind of prepare this, I found out that unit testing in .NET Core is actually a fair bit simpler to set up than it is in the traditional MVC framework, which is what I've used in the past. So I had allocated 2 full classes for it. We're probably not going to need 2 full classes. And we're also probably not going to finish everything I'd like to do with the shopping cart today. So we may continue with our shopping cart next week and push the unit testing off a week. That won't affect anything here, because assignment 2B, that's implementing unit testing in your assignment. So even if we don't do unit testing till here, you'll still have a week to do it. And then our last class will be using Web API. And then again, you have a week to do your Web API. That's also very small. That won't take you long to do. Okay. So we'll see where we get to with our cart, and we'll probably just resume. So we probably won't have a quiz next week as well. You know, the idea of finishing the cart, we're not really doing a whole lot of new stuff. So there's not really much new content that I could apply to a quiz. There'll be 1 or 2 new things, but basically we're just kind of taking what we already know and trying to wrap up and finish the cart. So we'll see where we're at the end of class today, but I don't think we're going to get the cart finished, and I don't think we need 2 full classes for unit testing. So we'll figure that out by the end of class. One other unrelated note to our course. Now, most people in the room, although not quite everybody, most people are in the web program, correct? A few in programmer in here, but most in web. Okay. So just so you know, for web, I actually have a meeting on Thursday. So what I'm trying to get it set up, so we're going to have 2 classes together in January if you're in the web program. We've got advanced server-side scripting, where we're going to learn Node.js. And we also have Project Studio, which is kind of we call that your capstone course, where we basically take all the stuff you've learned in all your different classes and we throw an actual project at you and we talk about the process, and you guys actually plan and build and launch a real application in groups over the semester. So on Thursday, so typically for that class, what I like to do is go out and find an actual client, an actual project, not just some assignment I make up for you. I find somebody who has a real need, and they come to class and they tell you about what it is they want, and you guys build it. So I've got a meeting on Thursday, and hopefully by the end of this week or next week, I may have a project lined up for you guys to go ahead and actually build. So students have done some neat projects in the past.
So each group build the same thing?
Typically, yes, but it hasn't always. There's been times where I've had different projects and different groups did different projects. Most of the time it's one project, and then each group kind of does their take on it. And then we sort of hand off all of the prototypes to the client, and they typically will pick one and try to work with the students to get it launched. That's sort of how it works. So I'm working on that, and I hope to have that kind of arranged in the next couple of weeks for you guys for January. Any questions about our plan? Well, that class is only part of the web program. There's a few students in here that are part of the computer programmer. They have a different course. They have a similar course if they do the 3rd-year option called their systems project, where they do that, but it's basically over 2 semesters. So it's at a bigger scale. So if you're in program and you stick around for the 3rd year, you'll have a similar kind of course spread over your last 2 semesters. All right, so let's open up our project. We'll get it running. I'm also going to open up my database just so that we can be having a look at what's going on in there as we're building out our cart. So we'll look at how far we got. So it looks like we had built an add to cart page. And I believe it did actually save to our database, although it wasn't fully complete. There's one thing we need to change. Help if I connect it to the right database. So I'm going to go and have a quick look at what's in our cart table. I think by the end of class last week, I was able to save a couple of items in there when I hit add to cart. Yeah. So I put a few items in and we just hard coded in the username. We hadn't had a chance really to deal with this. So here was our add to cart post method, where we took in the quantity, the product, ID, the price, and we were just hard coding in the user. We were saving to the database. So this was kind of where we left at the end of class last week. So if you're missing anything here, the code is obviously on GitHub. It is connected to my online database on Loosefoot. So I'll just start with this without debugging, and then maybe before we make any changes, we can kind of talk about what else do we need to do with this to make it complete, whether it's things we have time to do today or maybe things that lead into another class. So here's where we got to. We created the shop link in our navigation bar. Which is super quick to load. Good use of our time. So we built this page that showed the list of categories. And then we could pick a category and pick a product. And then I could choose any quantity, 1 or above, and add it to my cart. And then we got here because we're trying to load a cart page that we didn't have time to build. So if I go back and refresh, so there were 4 items in the cart table before. If I run my query again, a few of you are connected to my database, that's fine, I don't mind. So one of these is mine. You can see the problem with hard coding in the username, right? We now don't know who's bought what. So that was kind of our temp fix. So that's as far as we've gotten. So what other things do we want to do with this? Okay, so we'll need to code the username in the cart table. Yep. When adding to cart. Okay, that's one thing. What else are we going to have to do with this today? Right? Aha, okay. So we have not so much of a problem if our user's logged in. We already know who they are, so we could attach the items in their cart to that user. But if somebody isn't logged in, that's a little trickier. What if we have 2 anonymous shoppers? How do we know if Aria is shopping anonymously and I'm shopping anonymously, we both put the same item in the cart? We need a way of knowing that's yours and this one's mine. Okay, so we'll have to do that. What else do we have to do?
By the cart name?
Potentially. I would love to be able to. We'll have to think about that one. So possibly. Okay. So I will put it in here, Stephen. Okay. Yes. So we need. Okay. And what can users do on the cart page? Blair? Yep. So we're going to need to have a. Yep. We'll. I'll add that one. I'm just going to put a star beside these couple. Yes, we should have those. These are a little more complicated. If we're certainly not going to get to those today, but if we do well, maybe we can address those next week. So I'll leave them in here. Yep, so we'll have a checkout page. And ideally, we'll have payment. Yep. And then what would happen after? What do you typically expect to see? Yeah, some kind of confirmation. As well, we can kind of combine these. As a customer, you can also typically log in, and we should be able to see any orders in the past, right? I buy something, I pay, it doesn't come on time. I should be able to go up and look up that order. Or, for example, I bought something on a site bought something a couple of years ago. It took a long time for me to run out of it, and then I wanted to go back and look at that order to see how much did I pay for. I wanted to reorder it, but I wanted to look at my order history from 3 years ago to see how much did I pay for it at the time, for example. So these, fortunately, these will be easy because we can just scaffold these using the orders. We can scaffold an orders controller with views, and it will actually give us these pages. We'll want to modify them a little bit, but we can kind of auto-generate at least half of those using scaffolding. So I'll leave this list up and we can kind of cross things off as we go. But this is basically what we want to do today. So we definitely need to deal with this issue first, right? We've got two scenarios. A user's logged in and a user is anonymous. So if they're logged in, we already have, when they're logged in, let's go back, log in. We already have access to their email address. So we can tie the items in their cart to their email address, right? As soon as I log in, my nav bar should show me my email address. So that's readily available to us when somebody's logged in, no problem. The challenge is though when somebody isn't logged in. So we can grab this. If I shop now, I could use this as my username. That part's easy. But then the challenge is if somebody isn't logged in, we don't have access to their email, but we still need to identify each user uniquely because each user needs to have their own shopping cart. So what we'll do is the .NET framework contains a class called a GUID. Anybody have an idea what GUID stands for? Right, it's a globally unique identifier. So we can use this class to generate a string that will be guaranteed, the server will guarantee is random. So if Stephen and I are both shopping anonymously, I can generate a unique ID for his session and a unique ID for my session. So even if we both buy the same item at the same time, we can tie one to his ID and one to mine, and those IDs are going to be separate. So we'll use this class, and then our username will either be the email address if the user is authenticated, or we'll randomly generate a GUID, and then we'll attach it to that user's session. So long as the browser stays open and the user's session doesn't time out, this ID, this identifier will tie all the items to it. If they close their browser and come back, that ID gets destroyed for an anonymous user. So what we need to do is we need to write a method in our cart controller that will check, is the user logged in, yes or no? Well, we'll maybe write all of the logic of it first. So we want to check or set cart username. Let's see, how do we want to do this? Oh, actually, this can be private. String. So step one is we're going to see if we already have their username. So once they've put something in the cart, we're going to take their username and store it in the session object. So if we don't have any username in the session, that means there's nothing in their cart yet. This is the first item in their cart. So then we're going to check and say, do we know who the user is? Yes or no? So if yes, use their email.
Is there a reason why you would do one or the other? Hey, you can check if it's authenticated, right? But you didn't know they were logged in. That was first.
Yes, because the very first time, let's say, so there's no items in my cart at all. So the first thing we want to check, every time when we put the first item in, we're going to create this session variable. So the second time around when we hit add to cart, we're checking who the user is. We don't need to know if they're logged in. We just need to know, have they already put something in their cart? Because if yes, we've already got the session variable. We can just read from there. And then we can skip this logic. So this logic only needs to run once. It only runs in the event that this is the first item they're putting in their cart and there is no session variable created yet. So here's what we want to do. So in .NET, ASP.NET, the session object is part of the HTTP context library. So you can't just refer to session on its own the way we could in PHP. PHP, you could just use $_session. If I do this, it doesn't know what it is. So I have to use HTTP context.session. I know it's not coming up, but there's a get string method. So we will check for a session variable that's of type string called cart username. And I'll move this stuff in here. Let's close this up. Okay, so we're missing a reference here. When I mouse over my get string, it says you want to reference microsoft.aspnetcore.http. So I'm going to accept that suggestion. We need that reference. So my error goes away. And the reference is here on line 6. So remember, ASP.NET Core is very light. So many of the kind of supporting features we're used to seeing in web frameworks, it doesn't come with by default, including support for sessions. If we want our app to use sessions, we have to tell the app, hey, you need to track sessions. It's not built in by default the way it is in a language like PHP. So we make this reference. There's actually one more thing we're probably going to need to do to make the sessions work. Okay, so if our cart username is no, so in this case, I'm just going to initialize So now we need an if statement. We need to know, is the user logged in? So we can use our user object that we've used before. We've used this code before in our views to hide or show things depending on if our user's logged in or anonymous. So if they are authenticated, so this will give us their email address. And then I'll move this comment in here. And in this scenario, our session variable is empty. So we are going to need to use this GUID object to generate some kind of identifier because the person's anonymous. We don't know their email, so we've got to create our own way to identify them temporarily. So we're going to use this GUID class I mentioned, and there's a method in there called new GUID, so it'll generate a new ID and we'll convert it to a string. And now after my else, so we're going to create a new session variable called cart username. And then we'll pass in our variable that we're setting either here, if they're logged in, and here if they're anonymous. So we only need to go through all this logic the first time they put an item in their cart, because we're going to set this value the first time they put an item in. And then we're just going to reuse that same username every time they add a second, third, fourth item. Actually, so this is returning out. It's saying my method needs to return a string. I guess if we're going to store it in the session object here, then we can probably just make that void. It doesn't need to return anything. Just thinking for a minute. Sorry, no, I will do it. It'll make our coding a little easier later. Sorry, I'm going to keep it as a string, which gives me this error. So now down at the bottom of my method, we now need to return our value. So we want to send the name back out of this method because we need this value so that we can save. This value's got to go in this column when we save. Thank you. So before we save an item to the cart table, we need to call this method to determine what the username should be. And then we want the value that's calculated here to be included when we save to the database. So if we run our code right now, this method is here, but it doesn't actually, it's never actually called. So we need to call it before saving in add to cart. So we'll build so we want to go to our add to cart. We want to call this method first. It returns a string. It'll give us a username back. And whatever value comes out of here, that will need to go into right here. We will have to replace this temp user. I'll leave this up for another minute. Can you click on it for details? Okay, and on which line is it pointing to? Which would be what equivalent number where on mine? So what that's saying is, yeah, so this variable has to be declared outside our if statement. So declare it here, and then we're then taking this local variable and we're duplicating it in the session on line 97. So that way it will be available as the user rather than just existing for the purposes of our method. By putting it in the session, the user can navigate around our site and that value is persistent. So now in our add to cart, doesn't matter whether we do it here, before we, this line, create and save a cart object, we need to determine the username. So I'll create a local variable called cart username. And when we call this function will give us back either the user's email address or some unique identifier that's unique for their session. And then I need to change this on line 68. So what I've highlighted in blue, I'm going to take out where we were hard coding the username of temp user. What value would we replace this with? Aria? Right, we're going to take our cart username variable and insert it down here. So we'll try this. I think there's one more configuration item we're going to need. I'm not entirely sure our app is going to properly use the session object. We'll try it like this, but I think there's one thing we're going to have to set in our startup file to basically enable session support. We'll try it like this and we'll see what happens. There's, I think, a couple lines we're going to need to add to the startup file. So I've made two changes in add to cart. We're calling our new method that we just created. It returns a string, which we're storing here. And then we're inserting, using that string before we call save. So we'll build the project, we'll try it. We're still going to get an error here, redirecting to the cart, which doesn't exist yet. But I'll try this and we'll see what happens. I'm going to try, I actually use two different browsers. So I'm logged in Firefox. I'm also going to try an instance in Chrome where I'm anonymous. So we should get different usernames. In one case, it will be my email address. In another case, it'll just be some long, random, seemingly random string of letters and numbers. So I'll try it first here as an anonymous user. Okay. So yeah, our session has not been configured. So nothing wrong with our logic, but when it tries calling get string to see if there's already a username in the session, this crashes to saying there's no support for sessions. So we do need to add two small lines to our startup file to allow our application to use sessions. Then we can try it again. So I'll go to startup. So the first one, we've already made a bunch of changes to this configure services method where we've added identity, we've added Google Auth. Now this enabling sessions, this has to happen after this line. We have to enable MVC first. So we're going to call add session here. So that can go right at the bottom of your configure services method. And then we also need to make a call to use it in the configure method down below. Just like we have add MVC and use MVC, we need add session. And now down here, we'll tell our app to use session. So we've got use session in the configure method and add session in the configure services. And those can be the last line in each one of these. And if we build and try again, our items should save to cart, hopefully. And we can see the difference if we're anonymous and if we're logged in, what those usernames look like. So I'm going to try it again. In Chrome, we can look in the database, and then I'll try it in Firefox where I'm authenticated. Okay, we may have to do one more thing, sorry. We may have to do a little bit more configuration. I think so. Just bear with me for a second. Okay. I'm just going to compare it to my test project to see, have an idea what we may need to do. Oh, yes, I think I did it wrong. So we put it in the wrong order, I think, in startup. I'm sorry. I said this line needs to go after our MVC lines. It may need to go before. I'm going to try that. I may have gotten my order wrong. So I'm going to move both of these above the call to MVC. Help if I read my own notes. I'm just going to try this way. Okay, so now my session error has gone away. So again, my apologies. I told you to put the the use session below use MVC and the add session below add MVC. They actually need to go above it. They need to be enabled first, or MVC framework ignores them. So now if I look in my database, one of these is me. I think I added the $400. So if I add another product to my cart now in Chrome, it should give me this same username, because this username should now be stored in a session variable attached to my Chrome browser. So if I go back and pick another product, I now have this item and this item. So long as my browser window's open and my session doesn't time out, any items I put in my cart, they're attached to this. So we generated it the first time, but every item I put in my cart now, it's still this has gone in the session, so we're just reusing the same identity. What? It will get emptied. So, because, well, what should happen if I actually check out and pay for the items? If I click on my cart, once I'm done, it should show me that my cart is empty, right? It shouldn't keep, so we'll delete items once a user buys them. We'll basically move them out of this table into the order details table, and then we'll clear the cart if they purchase. So what about in Firefox? So I'm logged in this case. So if I add something to my cart here, it can just use my email address when I'm logged in. So if I add a second item, and the difference is in Firefox, my cart will be persistent. Because the items are attached to my email, if I close the browser and come back another day, that item should still be in here. In fact, I could do that. So I'll close Firefox entirely. So I'll close out of it, open it back up and put something else in my cart, but that item will still be here. Now we don't have the cart page to see it yet, but we'll do that in a minute. That's our next step. Thank you. So if I go back, ASP.NET Identity uses a cookie, so I should still be logged in, even though I've closed the browser entirely. When the site comes back up, it should still show me my username. That's interesting. Didn't expect that. I'll log back in. So I've still got 2 items tied to my account. So the store owner would prefer I shop as an identified user, right? Because it knows even if I don't buy these, it can keep them in my cart if I come back on subsequent visits. If we shop anonymously and we don't check out, the next time we come back, whatever we put in our cart one day is gone. So as a customer, we'd prefer to shop anonymously. As a store, they would prefer that we log in to shop. Now, there's one other scenario we're not going to get to deal with today, but I'm going to add it to our list. What happens when I shop anonymously, like I am in Chrome, but then it comes time for me to check out? So at that point, I have to log in. The challenge is these items aren't tied to my email address. They're only tied to my session. So once I log in, we'll want to go and look at my cart and update the username to use my email address once I log in. We're not probably going to get there today, but I'll add that to the list of at checkout, migrate items with GUIDs to use the user's email. So we'll get there. We probably won't do that today. Okay. I can put this code back up for a minute. So again, our sessions, this has to be done before adding MVC. I'll make a note. Well, at least by putting it after, we know that that doesn't work. That the order we enable sessions and MVC is important. I realize this method is kind of complicated. Well, the logic is sort of complicated. We got a bunch of different scenarios. Okay, what we will do is take a break. I will push what we've done to GitHub so far, and then our next step will be to deal with this. We need to create a cart method and cart view that will show the user what's in their shopping cart and allow them to either keep shopping, remove items, or check out. Sure.